Welcome everybody. My name is Michael Crawford. I'm the CEO of the Soil CRC, the Soil Cooperative Research Centre. By way of introduction to today's webinar, I'd just firstly like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting today, wherever we are situated across Australia. And I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. For those who don't know, the Soil CRC, the Soil Cooperative Research Centre, brings together 40 participant organisations from across Australia, from all states, a combination of universities, state government departments, industry groups, and importantly, 20 farmer groups from across Australia, coming together to undertake research to help give farmers the tools and knowledge they need to better manage their soil, and in turn to increase their productivity and profitability. We're 4 years into our CRC. We have 10 years of funding from the Australian government and support from our participants, both cash and in kind. We bring all those resources together to undertake research and adoption activities and leading to better outcomes for farmers over this period and beyond. We've got a whole range of projects in place, which I'll talk to you about in a minute. And today we're about to hear from one of them being from Nigel Wilcox. But just before I go further there, to give you an insight into our further webinar program, our next webinar to look forward to is on the 3rd of August, being delivered by Dr. Hannah-Beth Luke from Southern Cross University. Future farmers, what drives their decision making? Essentially, it's presenting the results of a whole range of surveys that have been done with farmers in North Central Victoria, Eyre Peninsula of South Australia, the wheat belt of Western Australia, and starting to get some insights into what they do, why they do it, and what their aspirations are in terms of their farming situation, especially in a soils context. So go to our website as you did for this webinar to enrol in that webinar. For those who want to know more about the Soil CRC, I encourage you to go to our website. We've got a full list of our projects and the descriptions there, who's involved in it. You can also follow us on Twitter at Soil CRC. You can connect with us on LinkedIn at Soil CRC. And you can subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can look at, in future days, look at the recording of this webinar and a whole range of webinars and other videos that we've produced in the past. They can also give you an insight into our project activity. So just on the topic of recording, today's session is being recorded. And as a registrant for this webinar, you'll get an update when it's available online. But you will be able to go to our website to connect with them or to our YouTube channel. I'm about to introduce Nigel. Before I do, just a quick view of where we're going to here. This will be, Nigel will speak for about 20 to 25 minutes. Then we'll have 10-15 minutes for questions. I encourage you to type your questions into the Q&A box, which you can access on Zoom. And then at the end of the session, I will read those questions out for Nigel to then answer. Hopefully, we'll be able to answer all the questions that we have in the time that we have available. So, to today's presentation, Nigel Wilcox. Dr. Nigel Wilcox works for Prime Industries and Regions South Australia. Nigel has been a leading research agronomist, soil scientist in South Australia, indeed in Australia, for a number of decades now. He's one of the go-to experts on a whole range of soil and nutrient related issues, especially in the grains industry, especially in South Australia, but his expertise extends beyond that. He is leading a project which he's going to talk about today on crop productivity on calcareous soils or crushed limestone. It's very exciting for us because it's a project that's co-invested with the Soil CRC and the GRDC, the Grains Research and Development Corporation, bringing together our resources to add value and invest in an issue that's of great interest to grain growers, in particular in South Australia and beyond. So Without further ado, I will pass over to Nigel to make his presentation. Thank you, Nigel.
Thank you, Michael. I appreciate the opportunity to give you a summary, you and your audience, of this major initiative of the CRC, looking at crop production on very calcareous soils. So what I hope to be able to do for people today is to present a summary of the issues behind this project, where the project team is and what we've achieved so far in terms of addressing this issue of restricted crop productivity on very calcareous soil. So I thank everybody for making some time available. Good morning to those in South Australia who are lucky enough to be enjoying cold, wet conditions at the moment, and further west, good afternoon to everybody else. So my intention today is to give you an overview of the issues behind this project, how we're going about tackling those issues and where we've got to so far. And just while I've got it there, I think the contribution and funding from the Soil CRC and also GRDC, which is a major supporter of grains-focused research and development across Southern Australia. So what I'll be doing is summarising activities for what actually the two projects, which we combined into what I'm calling one initiative, both of which are focused at lifting crop productivity on very calcareous soils. And we hope to the outside world that those two projects will always appear seamless as the one initiative. Okay, so where are we? Here's southeastern Australia. Here's the mighty state of South Australia, which you can see is actually a desert state dominated by semi-arid landscapes. But right around the coastline, there's a thin fringe of green stuff. That's our agricultural zone. So that's where the activities of this project are focused, because that landscape is dominated by calcareous soil. So they're a very important production soil type for us in South Australia, and that extends into West Australia, Victoria, and parts of New South Wales. I'll go into that in a bit more detail. So the project activities are very much focused on field sites in South Australia, but we have a project team that's scattered right across southeastern Australia. Our major mode of activity, and where a lot of the project staff are based, are in Adelaide at the Waite campus, but we also have staff and research teams in country South Australia, in both the very dry and hostile environments of the Eyre Peninsula, which are those far western red stars, but we also have research teams in southern New South Wales, and one of our leaders is in the hinterland of northern New South Wales. So we have a widespread team focused on calcareous soil issues. Part of our group is also two large farming systems groups that are resident in South Australia. So they're a very important part of our team. They have three roles for us, I guess. Initially, they identified the issues that are important to farmers who are managing calcareous soils. They keep the project grounded during its conduct, and also they're going to be an important vehicle for us to extend the outcomes to farmers and advisors also on those calcareous soils. So that's the spread and nature of our project team. If we zero in on South Australia itself, our highest profile activities are field trials, and we have them located in two regions in South Australia. One at the far western ones that you can see there. So we have three field trials sites. They're located in an important region for South Australia. That's the Eyre Peninsula. And that environment is dominated by calcareous soils, low rainfall, and extensive farming systems. So that environment's dominated by low rainfall, high degree of wind erosion, and extreme heat events during the grain field period of the annual cropping season there. Down in the lower right of South Australia, we have another field trial site. So that's also on a calcareous soil, but in a very different environment to the Upper Eyre Peninsula. That's in a wet area for South Australia, 500 millimetres of annual rainfall plus. Also on calcareous soils, but quite a different production zone, but still constrained by the properties of those calcareous soils. So that, as I said, they're our sort of flagship activities, which are the most obvious to the outside community in terms of what we're doing. So who are we? We are a multidisciplinary team that's scattered right across southeastern Australia, but focused on these calcareous soils. And we believe it's essential that we have a multidisciplinary team to tackle these issues of constrained crop production and to improve the soil properties of these calcareous soils with the aim of improving production and the profitability to farm businesses on those soil types. So we have a cluster of field research teams across two different agencies, both the state-based Department of Primary Industries in South Australia and with CSIRO based at the Wade Institute, with some of the senior scientists involved there in farming systems and soil science. And these regionally based staff in Minipa, Naracoorte and Port Lincoln are servicing and helping monitor those field trial program and interact with the more basic science teams based at Adelaide in southern New South Wales. CE controlled environment research teams. So we recognise that a lot of the issues involved in calcareous soils, we have to understand the problem first. That's more easily done under controlled environment conditions where we can manipulate and manage things with a much finer degree of resolution and control. So that's an important facet of this overall initiative. We have two teams operating there with the Department of Primary Industries in New South Wales, with soil scientists Esan Tavakoli and Lucas. And we also have sort of a management group with myself and Brian Zoma, and then the CSIRO team with those scientists I mentioned before operating at this more sort of fine and more basic scale of trying to understand the program, linking in with the field program so that we can ensure that the findings under controlled environment have practical applicability to commercial systems out in the field. And that third and very important node of activity are the close links we have with two farming systems groups in South Australia. So McKillop Farm Management Group in the southeast of South Australia, so they are a high rainfall, high production zone. And then the Ag Innovation and Research EP Group, which is a large farming systems group that services the entire Eyre Peninsula, which grows up to 40% of the state's wheat crop. So they're our important link into farmers and advisors at the coalface with this project. So that's who we are. Why do we exist? What are the issues we're attempting to tackle? And what you'll see there is a map of the calcareous soils across Australia as a continent. You can see that the southern states are where those calcareous soils are dominating. But for most of the states, or for a lot of states other than South Australia, a lot of those calcareous soils are actually outside the agricultural zone. If we zoom in on South Australia, we've got a map here of the surface layers of soil across the state. Anything that's not green is actually calcareous in the surface. So you can see that the agricultural zone, which is the area of the state that's coloured in this map, those red and yellow soil types, the calcareous ones, certainly dominate the landscape. And for some of them, we're having severe problems with crop productivity, and it's that throttle that we're trying to solve with this project. You can see that the Eyre Peninsula, the western part of that map, the calcareous soils and highly calcareous soils are a very important soil type for that region. And you can see there's a little spotting of pink stuff down in the very bottom of the state. That's high production cropping zone, and where we also have a node of activity. So this is what these calcareous soils look like. So what I've got here are soil profiles from the 3 field trial sites on the Upper Eyre Peninsula. So this is the low rainfall, low production zone we're tackling. And this is where these very highly calcareous soils dominate the landscape. And essentially they are crushed limestone, the first 2, and the last one I'll come to in a minute. This first one, the whole profile is essentially a sandy loam and is up to more than 2/3 of the profile is in fact limestone. So when I say highly calcareous soils, I don't say that lightly, it is in fact the reality. What comes with that material are are things that crops don't like, and that's things like salinity we have at depth. We have levels of boron, which can be toxic to plant production. And crop nutrition is also difficult on these profiles where essential nutrients such as phosphorus are tightly bound. And we also have some biological properties that come with these soil types, such as very high resident populations of a root pruning fungus, Rhizoctonia, is rife across this landscape and is one of the major constraints to crop production on these highly calcareous soils. The second site that we have in the project is also a very highly calcareous soil, has similar soil properties to the first one, but also has some important differences. And we hope to exploit those similarities and differences in trying to understand the constraints to crop productivity and unlock them so we can increase production on these soil types. The third soil type is also highly calcareous. It's quite different in nature to the first two, and it's a bridge to the rest of the southeastern Australian areas which have calcareous soils, but not as severe as the first two that I've highlighted on this slide. So we're working with the first two because they represent the extreme of these calcareous soils. This third site, if you like, is a bridge to all the regions where calcareous soils are important, but not to the extreme nature of those first two on Upper Eyre Peninsula. And that's, we hope we can, what we learn from these highly calcareous soils, this third site is a bridge into whether those lessons are still relevant to what in our terms are mildly calcareous soil types. The fourth site, this is the one in the high production zone and the wetter area of South Australia. It's quite a different soil. It's still dominated by carbonates, so limestone is still a major feature of the profile and drives the chemistry and properties of that profile. But where it's not limestone rock, it's a medium clay, so contrasts with the Upper Eyre Peninsula soils, which are sandy in nature and has some quite different soil properties, such as salinity is not an issue in this high rainfall country. Boron levels are low, bordering on deficient compared to the toxic levels we see on the Upper Eyre Peninsula, but has some similarities in terms of difficulties in managing nutrition for crops growing on those soil types, such as keeping up phosphorus in an available form to the crops growing on those profiles. So that's a snapshot of the field sites or the soil profiles that we're looking at. Quite contrasting environments, which we hope to exploit to our advantage in terms of trying to improve our understanding of what's going on, why we're not getting better crop production. And when I say that we're getting poor production, I've tried to capture this from the yield gap program, for which GRDC is a major contributor. So this is an example of the calculated yield gap across the cropping zone of South Australia. And where we're operating in this Western Eyre Peninsula area, the calculations are that the yield gap between what farmers are currently achieving and what should be possible based on the rainfall that falls in that environment is in the order of 1.5 to 2 tonnes per hectare. The problem with that is that they're only growing 2 to 3 tonne crops. So that gap represents at least half of the potential yield that that environment could realise based on the rainfall that falls there. So a very big gap. It's that gap that we hope to close with this project. Similar analysis down that wetter zone of South Australia, and the yield gap there is similar. This time we're looking at beans. So and production down there can be quite large, but that yield gap of 1.5 to 2 tonnes per hectare, again, represents about half the possible yield based on rainfall that should be being realised by fava beans in that environment. So the yield gap is large, it's driven by the soil type, and we want to unlock that throttle on production by improving soil conditions on these calcareous soils. This is what a poorly grown crop looks like on Upper Eyre Peninsula. So this is what a poorly productive crop typically looks like in that environment. It's not thrifty, it's not vigorous early on and does not yield very well at the end of the season. That extreme patchiness in this case is caused by that soil-borne fungus that I mentioned earlier, Rhizoctonia. So that's certainly a feature that goes with these soil types in that environment. What that fungus does to plant roots is in that picture I've just brought up on screen. Essentially, it chops the roots off. And you can imagine that a crop plant with such an impoverished root system, it's no surprise that that doesn't perform very well. So we want to stop that happening. What we have seen with modern farming systems is that 30 years ago, that fungus would trim all the roots off the plant, off the cereal plant. What it's tending to do in modern farming systems is it's attacking these nodal roots or the crown roots of the cereal system, of the cereal plant, trimming those. They are vital for nutrient uptake, but we're tending to see more of the seminal roots being preserved. Nevertheless, the production of these plants is still quite poor, and we want to overcome that problem, which is endemic in that upper air peninsular environment. In the southeast, we have quite a different suite of problems, and these have been identified by those local farming systems groups that I mentioned before. This is fava beans growing on that highly calcareous profile that I showed you before, this high production zone, and those plants will remain stunted for the remainder of the season. That's what they look like close up. And the belief is that the constraint to these fava beans is a combination of manganese and iron deficiencies, which they're failing to overcome in their current production systems. So we want to work out a better way of keeping manganese and iron deficiency at these crops so we can take production from the current 2 or 3 tonnes which they achieve in these yellow patches up to the 5 to 8 tonne that they can achieve on other soil types in that same environment. Okay, so that's who we are, that's where we are. That's a sort of a thumbnail sketch of the issues that we're trying to address. How far have we got with that so far? And we're about halfway through the funding phase of this project, but in terms of the outcomes, we're just at the tip of the iceberg. So we've had a long build up. Those field trials that I mentioned are now established and starting to grow through their early vegetative stage. So we're at the very cusp of a lot of activity and a lot of results to come in over the next 6 to 12 months. What have we achieved so far? First thing we did was to capture all the existing knowledge about calcareous soils and their impact on crop production in a literature review. So we have now nearly 60 pages of information about calcareous soils, their chemistry, their biological activity, and that combined impact on crop production. So it's a very valuable resource for anybody that's looking at this problem or is interested in that interface between an extremely calcareous soil and plant production. So we have that completed. We have a suite of controlled environment activities which are now underway. So they're looking at things like improving soil chemistry with some very novel and innovative approaches based on some iron minerals, biochar, trying to stabilise carbon and actually change the redox and pH conditions, which are quite extreme in these highly calcareous soils. That work's underway and we're starting to get a taste of the sort of impacts of some of these novel approaches on soil chemistry. One of the features of these highly calcareous sandy soils of the Upper Air Peninsula is they have quite unusual water relations, quite unusual for a soil of sandy texture. We think a key to managing them better is to understand those water relations. So we have a raft of activities being undertaken by the CSRO team to better understand those water relations. And combined with all those, we know that microbial activity and nutrient cycling are poor on these soil types, both in the low rainfall and high rainfall production zones. And we're deeply suspicious that they are a key behind unlocking increased crop production. So we have a team looking at microbial activity, nutrient cycling under controlled environment conditions. They're very much dovetailed in with the field trials. So they also have some activities based on resin exchange strips, additions with labelled N to monitor these things and trace them under field conditions to complement the controlled environment work. And using novel approaches like monitoring the growth of this is Rhizoctonia solani, the major pathogen in the upper EP environment. So some novel approaches to monitoring how that pathogen performs in these extreme soils. Just to give you a taste of some of the results that are emerging from this work. So there's been some incubation studies done by the New South Wales DPI team looking at various amendments to soils and their impact on carbon stabilisation and mineralisation of organic matter. So this is a result of a snapshot of results from an incubation study using one of those field soils where lucerne was mixed through the soil, stored for various lengths of time, and the impact of additives on the mineralisation of that lucerne monitored at various stages. So with nothing, that's our baseline, so no amendments to the soil, where they've used Genotype, which is an iron mineral, a small decrease in carbon mineralisation, so just an indication that we can manipulate soil conditions with additives to change the mineralisation rate of organic matter. We're trying to stabilise that organic matter for better cation exchange capacity, better nutrient cycling, higher microbial activity in these processes. If you add biochar, an active form of biochar which contributes to the cation exchange capacity and microbial activity, then the mineralisation of that lucerne jumps up and masks that effect of Genotype. So a lot of dynamic things happening in these projects, in these studies, which that team's starting to unravel. They've been delving into those iron minerals in more depth and finding that they're not all the same. So they have a range of Genotypes that they've been looking at and starting to work out those which are more effective in terms of carbon stabilisation and those that aren't. So some very exciting results coming from that team. We might be able to change those quite extreme soil conditions, chemistry conditions in those profiles. Similar vein, they've introduced a crop plant into the system now, not just looking at chemistry. So this is the growth of wheat in that field soil under these controlled environment conditions. And here's a biochar that I've been able to identify, which has been laced with a phosphorus source and has had quite a dramatic impact on wheat performance in that extreme soil. There's the same rate of phosphorus having nowhere near the same marked effect. So there's something about that combination of biochar and phosphorus that's doing something special. So that's certainly something we're excited to see. And under these conditions, you can see that iron mineral is not doing a lot for wheat production. So certainly a lot to unravel there in terms of not only soil chemistry, but how that plays out in terms of crop production and plant growth. In terms of field activities, I've mentioned those 3 sites on Upper Eyre Peninsula. They are the local names of those locations. We've got activities underway this growing season. And one site in the southeast of South Australia. We've fully characterised the profiles of all those sites. So we have the soil chemistry and properties of those profiles to depth. We have 2 trials at each of those 3 Upper Eyre Peninsula sites, one of which is focused on topsoil issues, one of which is focused on subsoil issues, where we've put a range of amendments deep into the profile, but still within the root zone. And the final trial in the southeast at Lake Horton is focusing on strategies to better manage manganese and iron deficiencies. So the field program's fully geared up. It's in place this year, and we're just starting to see treatment effects manifesting themselves in those trials. We managed to put in a demonstration trial last year, despite the project only sort of starting last year, to showcase the project. And here's crop production in that demonstration site last year using standard farming practice. And you can see it's very similar to that slide I showed you earlier. Poorly vigorous plants and suffering from that patchiness caused by the soil-borne fungus Rhizoctonia. And yet we had treatments which produced this type of crop that ended up in a 30% increase in grain yield. So certainly there's some scope that we can make dramatic improvements in crop production. This is by physical intervention. On the trial, it's basically wiped out the root disease and also improve the vigour and nutrition of the crop. So pleased to see that we can make inroads into crop production. Getting that to be profitable and reliable is a key to this project. So I'll wind up there. That's sort of my thumbnail sketch of the project, or these two projects, which are combined into the one initiative. And I thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you very much, Nigel. And it just disappeared, but you had Nigel's email address there, which people can follow up afterwards. But we've got the opportunity now to follow up directly by asking questions of Nigel and typing them into the Q&A box. Nigel, leave your video on, and because I'm about to fire a few questions at you. So the first question I have for you in the Q&A box is from Richard Bell from Murdoch University. Has claying of the calcareous sands been assessed? Is it effective? You might just want to explain what claying is for those who aren't familiar with it.
Yeah, so claying is a technique that farmers some use on silicious sands, which suffer from water repellent sands. So the claying is spread on the surface and then incorporated. That overcomes repellency and improves the texture of the soil. That hasn't been tried on these calcareous sands. Generally, the wetting properties are pretty good with these sands. It's a very expensive approach. So no, it hasn't been tried. It would improve the texture, but without the motivation of repellency as a problem, it's unlikely to be something that's profitable.
Right, thank you. Next one I got is from Felicity Harrop from North Central Catchment Management Authority in Victoria. Are the resources generated from the project to date, the lit review of soil characterisation, available now? If so, where? And I might need to answer that question myself, but I'll let you go first, Nigel.
Yes, in principle they are. Felicity, the literature review is submitted and signed off. So yes, that's available as a completed document. And we're doing our best to make the outcomes of the project available to the wider community. We're very much in a preliminary phase. So once we've got some confidence in those outcomes, then yes, we'll be doing our best to get them out to everybody who's interested.
And we'll be putting some of those resources onto our Soil CRC website under publications/technical reports. We're just working through a bit of a backlog at the moment. In the meantime, Catherine has put Nigel's email address in the chat box, nigel.wilhelm@sa.gov.au, so you can email Nigel directly if anyone has interest. Thank you.
Felicity, sorry, Mike, but yeah, there are a couple of podcasts that we did with GRDC. So they're on the GRDC website, which were at the start of the project. So give you an overview of the scope and intention, but you know, we're yet to generate outcomes.
Thank you. So I've got a question here from Anne McNeil from University of Adelaide, and it's got a couple of likes, so people really want to know the answer to this one. Microbial activity is reported as low in these soils, but pathogens seem highly active. Is there an understanding of the drivers for this dichotomy in microbial activity?
I guess we don't have the full answer to that, Annie, but yeah, certainly. And the surprising thing we found, I guess, is in that southeast soil, it's a clay soil, is also low activity. So we weren't expecting that. So it's high in organic matter, reasonable texture, high productivity, and yet the general microbial activity is quite low. I suspect the reason that we have some highly active pathogens is that they are exploiting that lack of competition. So certainly in the case of Rhizoctonia, it's something that doesn't compete well with the general population. So I think it's making use of the fact that the general microbial activity is low. It's exploiting that condition. In terms of maybe that's a factor as well. It's just less competition.
I'm going to jump onto Helen Hayden's question. Helen, because it's directly relevant. Helen's from Agriculture Victoria. How was microbial activity measured?
I knew I'd get something I wasn't schooled up on. Helen, look, I can't give you an authoritative answer on that. We're using a range of techniques. So we have Gupta Vadakatu as part of our project team. So he's just started this work. So initially it's looking at the more standard microbial activity measurements of CO2 evolution, etc. But with Gupta and also with Lucas's team, we're looking at some more innovative approaches at capturing microbial activity and function.
Thanks, Nigel. And Helen's acknowledged, and she'll ask Gupta about it. For Michael Rose at New South Wales Department of Primary Industries, thanks, Nigel. Is there any evidence of zinc or molybdenum deficiency in legumes affecting crop production at these sites? Are treatments being applied that may affect these micronutrients?
It's a qualified yes, Michael. Moly deficiency we don't see very often on these soil types. Moly deficiency or availability improves under alkaline conditions. So one of the few elements it does. So it's not something we see very often. Zinc, manganese are more commonly seen across these soil types. And it's a well-known problem in that southeastern environment. Yes, it's something we're watching very closely, Michael. We know trace element deficiencies are a factor in these environments. So we're looking to see if we're getting secondary effects from some of these amendments on trace element nutrition.
Good, thank you. So that's all the questions we have in the Q&A box at the moment. So I'll just give another minute for people to quickly type in other questions. In the meantime, the podcast that Nigel was referring to, Catherine's found the link and she's posted it in the chat box. So go there, or at least link on it now, and so you can go back to it later and watch it at your leisure. All right, now we've got a couple more coming in. So from Richard Bell first, will you look at genotypic differences in the zinc, manganese and iron deficiency?
Richard, yeah, definitely we are. And we're also conscious that there's projects underway looking at genotypic differences in tolerance to sodic soils, sodic conditions, etc. So yes, we think that's a valuable tool. I suppose we see it more in a package looking at topsoil conditions, where we're looking at just trying to improve, incremental change. Where we're looking to change subsoil conditions, we really need a step change in terms of production to justify the costs of those deep ameliorations. So certainly a genotype package is part of that, but we're really looking for a doubling of yield, if you like, to justify those interventions, in which case we're just looking at overall better crop production.
Thanks for that one, Richard and Nigel. So from Michael Rose again, what was the treatment that was applied in the Pachira pilot that increased the yield by 30%?
Yeah, that was a deep ripping treatment. So we had deep ripping with a range of amendments as well. And deep ripping with deep placement of biochar was looking very good for most of the season, a 50% increase in biomass. But in the end, deep ripping was that produced similar yields to those where we had the amendments as well. So just physical intervention gave us that 30% yield increase.
Okay. Nigel, no more questions there. I might just ask one to keep the discussion going. And looking at what farmers are doing, dare I say leading farmers, leading grain growers across these soils, and is there anyone that's doing anything different that stands out as being more successful in achieving higher or closer to the yield potential?
Look, there are, and I guess the most obvious one is there's a group of farmers that are using fluid sources of phosphorus. Phosphorus nutrition is a problem on those extreme soil types. Fluid forms of phosphorus are far more effective than the granular forms. So there are a group of farmers that are using those fluid P sources for superior performance. I guess the difficulty there is the fluid Ps are more expensive. What they tend to do is cut rates back and achieve, you know, crops that aren't that different to everybody else, but at a lower rate of P.
All right, thank you for that, Nigel. I see no more questions there, so I'll start to wrap up. Thank you very much for that overview and where the project's up to, where it's going to, and some of the treatments. So I know you're working closely with those two grower groups that you spoke of in the Eyre Peninsula and lower southeast with McKillop Farm Management Group. And so those growers and the consultants, etc., attached to them we'll see what's going on there. Also, being co-invested by GRDC, there'll be a lot of communication through the GRDC channels and pathways, as well as through the Soil CRC to keep up with what's going on. All right, I will wrap up, and I'll just share my screen once again to remind you of our next webinar in the series on the 3rd of August. Dr. Hannah Beth Luke, Southern Cross University, speaking about the results from her farmer surveys across 3 states to date and where they're going to with future surveys. So go to our website and enroll there. And just more generally speaking, look to our website, our Twitter, our LinkedIn and our YouTube channel for information about this project and others in the Soil CRC more generally. We're in a period, it seems, of limited social contact with COVID restrictions now being imposed in Adelaide and Victoria, New South Wales. So I wish you all well right across the country and look forward to catching up with you again shortly. Thank you.